Hello, hello, civic students. Happy Friday. It is the 30th of October, the day before Halloween, so I am dressed up as little Red Fred Riding Hood, sporting my teacher, supporting Oakland teachers and students, as always. Uh, we are here ready. Oh my gosh, are we ready? There is how many more days left until our election? Well, we've got Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Tuesday is our election day. We have been spending about a couple months anticipating this election by really getting to discuss what voting means. What is voting? Who votes? How do people vote? And why it is important to vote. Not only that, we've been really discussing how has voting rights changed throughout the United States history. So make sure you've got the supplies that you need with you. I can see I have got a few viewers here already. Hello, Dermot. Hello, Arel. Oh, it is so great that you guys are here. The way that we are going to move forward in today's lesson is you do have a exit ticket that I posted with a link to this video. You don't have Makerspace today, so I made a mistake and added that up there, and so I can do a quick, fix if I would like to, take care of that, but, we're just, that you don't have Makerspace after this. However, we are going to be writing a paragraph. We are writing a paragraph discussing and answering our focus question. And what is our focus question? Well, we've been asking ourselves this question, which is, why is voting harder than just checking the box? Now, in our exit ticket, some of you will notice that I kind of tweaked the question a bit, and I asked, is voting as simple as checking a box? Okay, so kind of two questions, similar but different. Now, Dermot asked, do we need our notebook? If you learn best by taking notes as we go along, absolutely. I think that that would be a great thing for you to have with you. That way, if there's a word that you see or are unfamiliar with, you can write it down and ask that as a question a little bit later. So the way that we are going to move through today's lesson is we stopped our lesson on Tuesday in the middle of rereading that News ELA article. Now, I found another really great video that we are going to watch that kind of summarizes what we're going through right now in voting today, but also summarizing a lot of what we've already covered. Okay, so we're going to start our lesson off watching about 3 minutes of a video, and it is a short clip that we will be watching that is a part of a longer episode that's available on Netflix. So if you have Netflix, you might ask your parents if you can finish watching this episode a little bit later. It is filled with a lot of really useful information, and it is meant for people who are older than 5th grade. So really, if you would like to watch the entire episode, you can ask your parents if you can watch it with them later on. Hi, Bear. Great that you're here. I'm so happy you're here. You know my name. My name's not just teacher. Okay. Let's get going. So just to recap how we're going to move about in today's lesson, I recommend that you have a notebook with you. If you want to title it just voting rights, you could say T minus 4 days until the election if you would like, right? Which is today minus 4 days. We're in the countdown, in the final countdown. While you're taking notes, we are going to watch a quick 3-minute video clip. Then we're going to continue where we left off in that PowerPoint, which is helping us go through all of the really important things that were listed in that article. Okay, so let's get going.
1776.
I don't think it's able. I don't think it's showing up for you guys. So give me 1 second. Let's double check that it is coming up. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. I might have to just try something out real quick. I'm gonna add this. Okay, maybe this will work this time. Here we go, we're in business. Alrighty, gotta just move a few things around slightly. Here we go. Thanks for being patient with me, you guys. All right. Now you're not going to be able to see me, but that's fine. Oh, here we go. Let's try this again. Ways in which the right to vote has evolved and changed throughout history. And really also considering not just how, people have received rights to vote throughout time, but how does this video clip help us understand why voting is harder than just checking the box? Are all people exercising their right to vote? And in addition to that, if people are believing that if there is such thing as too many people voting, how does that help our democracy? Okay, thinking about democracy, we want the majority to voice their opinions, and that's the way that democracy is supposed to work, is that people share their ideas, and depending on the majority of how people are feeling, that majority represents the vote and who, the direction of the country that we're going into. Let's take a second. I'm going to pull up our video, or excuse me, our other slideshow, where we are going to continue looking at the article that we started reading on Tuesday. Okay, so let me come back and change our, great. So now what we're going to be doing is we are going to, let's see, here we go. We're going to continue where we left off before, where we are considering, well, we started reading how is voting in the US harder than just checking the box? And we have to really think and ask ourselves, well, why is it harder than just checking a box? Well, we need to find evidence. If we're going to make a claim that voting is harder than just checking a box, we're going to need to make sure that we have evidence to support that claim. And if people are making a claim that voting is as simple as just checking a box, that they also have evidence to support that claim. And here we can use vocabulary to get an understanding of, like, what is a vote? How do people vote as a verb? And what does it mean to be a voter, right? Now, we also got our introduction to this text where we read and we're thinking, well, not just asking ourselves, like, how do we think about voting, but talking to our family members about voting as well and their own experiences. We discussed who was allowed to vote at the start of our country and how certain constitutional amendments have given other rights to individuals who are not just white property-owning adult males, right? Or not just being a male to be able to vote. So we're going to kind of speed forward and look at the part where we left off previously, which was, we left off with this third part, which is considering, well, how do states limit voting? Well, we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said that you are not allowed to have voting intimidation or a tax to vote, or having to show certain types of official identification, right? A lot of people, are fighting against being limited to express their vote. Now let's keep on moving. So the fourth part of this article said, or asked this question: why is this left to individual states to decide who can vote? Why doesn't our federal government, who the federal government refers to the, executive branch, really, and Congress, why did they decide that it's going to be up to each state to figure out who wants to vote? Well, let's read this together. The Constitution gives state legislators, who are like our Congress or Senates and House of Representatives, power over voting in their states. But Congress has the power to change these rules. That's what it did with the Voting Rights Act. Part of that law required that 9 states had to get legal approval before changing voting rules. Now, in 2013, the Supreme Court threw out that requirement, and really, that because of how the Supreme Court ruled, that let states make more restrictive voting laws. If you're like me, I'm wondering, what can citizens do to voice our concern that we shouldn't have restrictive voting laws? In this video that we started off watching, people were saying, well, is it possible to have too many people voting? I'm going to ask that question again. Is it possible to have too many people voting? Consider where the United States, out of all these other developed countries in the world, is rated as far as how many people who are able to vote actually vote. So if we have about half of our population is actually voting, I'm wondering, why are there more restrictive voting laws? If we only have just over 50% of people who are able to vote are voting, why are there certain people who want to have more restrictive voting laws? So this is a really important question that we are asking ourselves and trying to consider and think, why are people wanting to restrict people's ability to vote? So as we move forward in this article, we want to say, well, how many states have passed stricter voting laws? Well, since 2010, 25 states have passed stricter voting laws. They include restrictions on registration. So that means that you have to register within a certain time. That means that some states say early voting is not going to happen. This is also saying that some people are saying that you have to show your ID to be able to vote. Well, does every American drive? Do all Americans have a driver's license or an ID? These are all questions that are coming up for me and might come up for you. And here you might see that during this reading, we want to think, well, should IDs be a limitation for voting? Why would people want to have an ID for voting? Okay, well, let's ask ourselves, well, how do these voter ID laws work? Well, in the states with the strictest laws, a voter must present an official identification, and it must have a photo on it. The most common, like I mentioned, is your driver's license. But if you don't have a photo ID from the government, you might not be able to cast your ballot. And for your vote to be counted, you might have to bring that to the election office in addition to when you're, casting your vote. So for instance, supporters of these laws kind of compare it to like airport security. They say you need to prove who you are to board on a plane, right? So you should be able to prove that you are the person casting your vote. But people who disagree with that say that voter fraud on election day, where people come to and pretend to be a person that they're not, and to maybe cast a vote that is from someone else who is not them, that is actually very rare. And when we talk about being able to have evidence, we need to say, well, when have there been instances of voter fraud? How often does this occur? And Republicans often say that there is voter fraud, and that's why we should have stricter voting laws so that voter fraud doesn't happen. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what proof do they have? And if there are people who are voting in a fraudulent way, how is our government stepping in and trying to make that happen less, right? Democrats say that they think Republicans just want these stricter voting laws to discourage voting, okay? And, it's worth mentioning that people of different socioeconomic status, where if you don't have that much money, you might not have a photo ID because you might not drive. You might rely on public transit. Like so many people I know don't have driver's licenses, right? So thinking about if you turn 18 and you live in the Bay Area and your driving is not a priority for you because number one, it costs a lot of money to get a car and to have driver's license, to get your driver's insurance and a test and all of these things, you might not have an ID with you, right? And consider, should that be a limiting factor for you to submit and cast your vote? So really considering, why is, voting so hard in some places, right? And thinking, okay, well, we know that some places are saying you need an ID. Some other places are saying, well, you need to register to vote, like, and say like, I'm going to vote in this upcoming election and this is where I live. Well, some people like to register really early. Some places have different rules and regulations about registration. And in this way, this is another way that our government is saying, well, from the federal side, they're saying this choice has to be within the state. So California is going to have different regulations than in Ohio, right? And Ohio is going to have different regulations than in Iowa or in Tennessee or in Maryland or in Washington state, right? All of these places are going to have different rules because our federal government says that each state should decide on their own, okay? So for example, each state is going to try to keep their registration rules up to date. And so they do this by removing the names of people who maybe died, maybe they moved, maybe they went to college somewhere else, or maybe they became ineligible to vote, maybe they went to jail and was committed with a felony, and so they're no longer eligible to vote. But people often say that, the registration, it goes too far, and it does prevent some people who are eligible to vote from voting. Now is the time where we have to think, well, there's 4 days until this election. Okay. 4 days is not obviously we're not going to have states making big changes with certain voting laws, right? Voting to make a constitutional amendment, it takes time and power, and Congress has to agree and vote on it for there to be an amendment on making voting easier throughout the United States. But here, let's see what this article says about how we can make voting easier, okay? So some people tried to move Election Day to the weekend, and that failed. That did not happen. And the same thing, there's a lot more talk about making voting or election day a national holiday. Really, many other countries in the world hold elections either on the weekends or have it as a holiday where people don't have to work. And we celebrate as a nation and say, this is the day where we're going to celebrate democracy. And all you have to worry about is casting your vote for the day. Well, we haven't had that. But this is a big one. 40 states now allow early voting. And so in many places all over the country already, and I'm sure there are some of you out there that have been kind of peeking into the news with your parents and listening and observing, well, guys, this is something quite powerful because already with early voting, so many more people have already voted than they did in the 2016 election. In fact, I believe there are already over 60 million votes that have been casted because of early voting. This is quite powerful. Now, when we have early voting, they're going to open up polling places during the day or in the week. And in a lot of these places, early voting periods not just include getting to go to the polls early, but also accepting mail-in ballots for the election. So right now, there are only 5 states in all 51 states that accept mail-in ballots for all the elections. California is definitely one of them. And others are currently, loosening up their rules for absentee voting, which we know when you have an absentee ballot, you're doing it ahead of time and on your own. So really, this is quite powerful. Some people also brought up thinking, well, why not have voting online, right? Why can't voting be more accessible to people? Well, this is a big one. There's a big fear about security, right? We know that there are cyber security issues where people can get hacked or other things like that. And I know that some U.S. states let military members and citizens who are maybe studying abroad or living somewhere else can vote online. And so this is quite interesting. But as we know, there's been no, move to making this happen. And this is also an interesting conversation to bring up with your family. Should voting online be like a social media platform? What do you think? So really, there are lots of different ideas already going on and about how to make voting more easily accessible. But what I want us to do is, this question is really thinking, well, what is the main article about, or what is the main idea of this article? But really, the piece that I want us to finish with today is thinking, okay, well, is voting harder than just checking a box? How do we know that it's harder than just checking a box? And this term, voter suppression, means that, to suppress something is almost like pressing down, right? It's kind of sounds similar to the word oppress. But suppression is saying that, you're going to make it harder and try and keep people from voting. Is this happening in the United States right now? How do we know that this is happening? And really, this is a time for us to think as Americans, how can we really push forward and saying, well, democracy is voting. So if having a democracy and voting means that, we are being honored and seen and that each person has power because your vote has power. Well, if there are people who are saying, I'm so sorry, actually voting should not be for everybody, is that an American thing to say? If the core of America is being democratic and having a vote and knowing that your vote holds power, is preventing people from voting, is that American? Or is that anti-American? So what you're going to be doing is, this was a very long lesson. I ended up going over in time because I know that you don't have makerspace after this. So you might break this lesson up into a few spaces, but I wanted to make sure we talked all about this because this is going to be our last core lesson before the election. We might have a core lesson on the day of the election, but I wanted to make sure we talked about voting and why voting might be hard or easy depending on where you live. Okay, so go ahead and take a look at that exit ticket. I have scaffolded it so that you have the directions, the focus question, and that you know you're making a claim and then finding 3 pieces of evidence to support your claim. If you're going to say voting is harder than just checking a box, why is it harder than just checking a box? How do you know? And then your conclusion is simply summarizing your point. In conclusion, I believe this. So that concludes our lesson for today, kiddos. I hope you have a wonderful Halloween, and I will see you in about an hour for our spooky Halloween reading. Farewell, kiddos.